Hello and welcome to the talk on low-dimensional dynamics of encoding and learning in recurrent neural networks. My name is Stefan Horoi and this is joint work with Geadah under the supervision of Professors Guy Wolf and Guillaume Lajoie from the Université of Montréal and Mila. This work was presented at the 33rd Canadian Conference on Artificial Intelligence in May of 2020. Recurrent neural networks, or RNNs in short, are neural networks containing intralayer connections which allow them to keep information inside the network across multiple time steps. This makes them well suited for the analysis of sequential or time-dependent data, and it also suggests that the key to better understanding RNNs resides in analyzing them as nonlinear dynamical systems, as was done in multiple studies. The image here is taken from the Sucia 2012 study, and it shows internal trajectories of RNNs projected in a three-dimensional space. However, in order to look at RNN as dynamical system, we need to analyze the network's internal representation first. In particular, the geometry of the internal representation were linked to the internal dynamics of RNNs. In deep neural networks, the geometry of internal representation were also linked to the classification accuracy. This has not been established in RNN since links between geometry and performance have not been established. We set out to analyze the geometry of internal states and the network dynamics in parallel and to try to quantify the effects of these two factors on the classification accuracy of the networks in the sequential MNIST classification task, where we showed the 28 by 28 pixels MNIST images to our networks, one line at a time. So as time progresses, we go further down the image. Our networks had an input layer of 28 neurons, each receiving the information about one single pixel at each time step. We had one single recurrent layer of 210 H neurons and a final output layer which had 10 linear neurons. Our model was a standard RNN model, where the internal state at time step t is computed by tan h of the input weight matrices times the input at time step t plus the recurrent weight matrices times the internal state at time step t minus 1. At the final time step, which is capital T, we can have a linear readout by multiplying the output weight matrices by the internal state at the final time step. The elements of our weight matrices were sampled from a normal distribution. For training and implementation, we used the PyTorch library and the Adam optimizer with the cross-entropy loss function. The networks were trained on the training data sets for 30 epochs, and the accuracy of the networks attained was 93%, which, despite not being state-of-the-art, ensures that the networks were able to generalize from the training data. While the networks were trained on the original training data sets, the accuracy was actually measured on three different modifications of the validation data sets. The first being the hidden images, where we showed the first n lines of the images with n ranging from 0 to 28, and the rest of the lines are made blank. Then we have the cut images, where again we show the first n lines of the images, but instead of making the rest of the lines blank, here we just cut the images, so the sequence length is reduced, while here we let the dynamical systems drift. And finally, we have the extended images, where we show the whole image and then we let the dynamical systems drift with blank lines at the end. 10 networks were trained on the original training data sets and were tested on these modified versions of the validation data sets. If we look at the classification accuracy as a function of the sequence length, here in blue we can see the accuracy on the cut images, where the sequence length is less than the training sequence length, which was 28. And in orange we see the accuracy on the extended images, where the sequence length is greater than 28. We can see that the classification accuracy is only at its peak at the training sequence length, and at all other sequence length, the classification accuracy is no better than random. A pretty good plot to look at also is the classification accuracy of the networks on the cut image datasets in blue, compared to the hidden image datasets here in orange, where we can see that for the same given amount of real pixel lines shown, we can have a great difference in the precision. For the hidden images, where we let the sequence length reach 28, we have a greater classification precision than for the cut images, where the sequence length is just reduced. Which this shows us that regardless of the amount of information given, the sequence length is the main factor determining classification precision. However, this raises the question, is the information not present at all in the networks, or is it stored in the networks but not interpretable by the final layer? And in order to answer this question, we looked at a class or digit colored clustering of the internal representation at 3 different time steps. The clustering was done using the Tisny dimensionality reduction algorithm. At time step 5, so after only 5 lines of the image, 5 pixel lines of the images shown, you can see that some structure begins to form as the network groups together certain images that it identifies as being 6s. At time step 28, so when the classification takes place, we see that the digits are clearly separated in clusters. However, as we let the dynamics drift at time step 78, so after 50 blank lines, we see the clusters begin to degrade. So the task-relevant structure is developed as soon as information is provided. However, this structure is simply not interpretable by the final classification layer. If we try to classify the dynamical system, which gives us these clusters, we can look at the autonomous dynamical system associated with our network equation and compute the Lyapunov exponents, which are powerful classification tools for the geometry of dynamical systems. In particular, the maximum Lyapunov exponent, here denoted by lambda 0, was computed using here mu 0 is the largest eigenvalue in norm of this matrix here. Capital Fn is simply the multiplication of all the Jacobians of ht from time step 0 to time step n. Now, computing this MLE, what we found is that before training, we are in a state of exponential volume compression, since the MLE is less than 0, meaning that all trajectories converge to fixed points. However, this regime is changed during training to a volume preservation regime where the MLE is 0, which means that trajectories start showing periodicity and we can expect limit cycles to emerge. If we try to further look into this and try to classify these limit cycles to see what they look like, we can look at the UMAP representations of the internal states, where the digits are in separate clusters at time step 28, as was shown in the Tisny images. However, as we let the dynamical system drift by adding blank lines at the end of the images, we can see the clusters degrade into 2 limit cycles, and after enough time passes, we can see that the limit cycles are clearly defined and that trajectories settle into those limit cycles. Meaning that we have been able to identify that the RNNs use 2 limit cycles in order to solve the classification problem presented to them. In conclusion, we have shown different perspectives on how information is processed in standard RNNs. Information is actually kept as multidimensional clusters corresponding to different classes. However, this information is not interpretable by the final layer, since the accuracies is no better than random from almost all sequence length, unless the sequence length of the input is the same as for the training images. As the dynamics settle, the internal representation are compressed into a non-trivial attractor, which is composed of 2 limit cycles of intrinsic dimension far smaller than that of the internal representation space. For future work, in the short term, we hypothesize that information about digit classes might be encoded as phases on the limit cycles. We have preliminary results for this, even if they were not shown here. And in the long term, we would like to look at other recurrent models, such as LSTMs or GRUs, which are also defined by their dynamics, and we expect the same analytical framework to be effective in less artificial scenarios. And we would like to extend the analysis to tasks that have intrinsic sequential structures, such as human activity recognition or natural language processing tasks. We would like to thank Aude-Forcion Lambert and Giancarlo Kirk for useful discussion, and our funding organisms, which are CRM, ISM, Ivado, FRS, FRQNT, NIH, and NSERC. Thank you very much for listening.